just let me know if it's not as we go on here. So yeah, really interesting story. I did not know about this until actually just last week. But basically, 7 hikers leave to go on a hike in Siberia. I'm going to move my microphone again so it's not in my face. Leave for a hike in Siberia in the summer of 1993. And of the 7, only 1 returns. And she returns with quite a strange story. One that not only is rather bizarre, but doesn't match up to a lot of the different, if you kind of logically go through the explanation of what could have happened to these hikers, there's weird gaps to it, which lends to all kinds of speculation as to what the problem was, what happened to these folks. It's a mystery. But unlike the Dyatlov Pass incident, which some of you may be familiar with, where I think that was 9 hikers that were all found dead months later, this has a survivor with an eyewitness account. So very freaky, very, very creepy story. I'm going to try to do it justice here. So it all starts off with a experienced hiker and teacher named, and I'm sorry if I'm not Russian, so if I mess up some of these Russian pronunciations, please forgive me if anyone does know. Ludmila Korovina. I'm just going to refer to her as Korovina going forward. She was 41. She was a master hiker, teacher, survivalist, and she taught at a local institution in Kazakhstan. And she did different expeditions. And so she had this set up to do this expedition to this mountain range on the southern edge of Lake Baikal, which is in Siberia. And if you're not familiar with Lake Baikal, it is the deepest lake in the world. It is a huge lake, very interesting. There's all kinds of neat, even National Geographic things about it. It's a very interesting place. It's huge, but it's out in the southern part of Siberia. And so this mountain range is on the southern end. They're not very tall mountains. They're about 6,000 to 7,000 feet tall. So we're really not at levels where altitude sickness would be an issue. That will become important later. It's also a very popular summer destination. So there's lots of hikers. There's lots of people going through this. So this journey, this trip that they're planning on isn't in a really remote area, which again will come into play as we go through this. So hello, Dee. Glad to have you on here. So what happened is she started getting this group together to go. And so the different players in this are herself, Korovina, Alexander Krysin, who was 23. He was the kind of the strongest of the group. He was also one of the oldest. Although all of these folks were, experienced hikers. So they did other trips with her on these, or they've done other expeditions. So these weren't like first-time students going out to do this. They all had some level of experience behind them on these trips, although for a lot of them, this was going to be the longest expedition that they've gone on. But he was doing these events since he was about 12 years old and knew Korovina very well. Korovina actually considered her a son to her, so they were very close. He had just finished his final exams in university in Moscow and was getting ready this was part of the summer celebration to go do this trip. Denis Shavakin, who is 19, and interesting and kind of sad story here. He only joined the group because, again, this was like a larger hiking group, and then they took like a subset to go on this trip. He only joined this group because another one, their parents wouldn't let them go. And so his parents were not there. So he wrote them a note saying, off to the mountains, be back, and just left to go on this trip. Timur Babanov, who was 15, his parents were adventurers, and that kind of got him into this kind of lifestyle and kind of into these things. So he's done a lot of these as well. He was 15 years old. Tatiana Filipenko, who was 24. So again, most of these are teenagers except for Korovina, who's 41, and then Alexander who was like a second son, who was 23, and then this Tatiana Filipenko, who's 24. She was a secretary at the school where Korovina taught, and went on some of these hikes, and was on several of these expeditions. But again, this was the biggest one that she was going to take part in so far. There's a couple stories like this. Victoria Zelasova, she was 16. She was on some earlier trips with Korovina, and Korovina did not want to take her on this one, mainly because she was known to be a complainer and also struggled in one of the winter weather hikes that they went on. So she didn't think she had the stamina or kind of the mental attitude to go on this trip. Her parents actually called and talked Korovina into including her in it. Valentina Udachenko, who was 17, she was known for her mental and physical stamina and toughness. Now I'm going to pull this picture over. Let me know, in case this is a bandwidth, if my audio goes. Because if the audio goes, I won't do this, or I'll do this very quickly. So I'm going to bring this over. So there they are. So, can you guys see the cursor? I'm not sure if you guys can see the cursor when I pull it over onto them. Let me know if you can or not. But I'm going to try. I'm going to assume this anyway. So this is Korovina. Second from the right is Korovina. I'll kind of go I'll go left to right here. So far left here is the Valentina Udachenko, 17, the one known for her mental toughness. Right here is Denis Shavatkin, the 19-year-old who replaced somebody that left. Here is Victoria, who was the one that Korovina didn't want to go originally, and parents talked her into it. Here is Timur, the 15-year-old, again, Korovina. Here is Tatiana, who is 24, the secretary. And then down here sitting at the bottom is Alexander, who was the one that she considered a son. I'm going to pull this off again just in case, again, it does pull bandwidth, but wanted to at least show you the pictures. And, some of the other stories you'll see on there will have people. This was 1993 stuff. So this is just interesting. Another part is Korovina was a single mom. Her daughter was 16, and her daughter was also leading a group. And this was not an uncommon practice. So they were doing this hiking group. They were going to go in 2 groups and then meet at certain spots as they went through this mountain range. And so this is going to become a factor later. So her daughter, who was 16, led one group. Korovina led the other group. And they started on August 2nd and made great time. Got to the top of their target mountain, I believe, on August 3rd. And then August 4th is when things started going downhill. Now, one of the things is historically, and this is kind of pre-internet, and if you remember, kind of Soviet Union collapse not long before this. So this isn't this is kind of a chaotic part of the world right now. So some of the information isn't all that great on the weather piece, but they also didn't have access to get really good up-to-the-minute forecasts. But typically in this area, this time of year, the temps don't get below 50. But what happened was there was either they're called like a Mongolian cyclone, or I've also seen reports where a large typhoon hit kind of because it's the eastern coast of Russia around this time, or into like China and possibly drifted in. So it may have been remnants of this system, maybe matching up with some other weather systems. But basically, uncharacteristically, it was very, very heavy rain and very, very cold. So actually, so on the 4th, it started raining very hard. They were up on this one mountain. I'm not naming the mountains because I'd butcher the names of them anyway. So I'm just going to be very descriptive here instead. And they decided to camp for the night on the 4th on a, let me go back. Around August 6th, Korovina's group was supposed to meet her daughter's group. And then what happened was Korovina's group never showed up. Now, this is odd. The daughter thought, well, she must just be delayed. There must be some kind of delay. Actually, they continued on the hike, and she actually flew home to Kazakhstan and didn't find out what happened until she was back in Kazakhstan. Now, I don't know what's, normal for this part of the world, but certainly that's one thing that sounds a little bizarre. I believe it is August 9th. So I'm going to kind of go backwards. August 9th, a group of kayakers from Ukraine are going down this river, and they see a girl on the banks, just kind of standing on the banks, kind of looking out of it. Doesn't wave to them, doesn't really acknowledge them, but they said she didn't really look like she was in distress, so they kept going down the river. Then their conscience gets to them, and they decide, hey, we better go back and check on her. And so they went back up the river. I don't know if they, paddled up the river or if they got off and hiked up the bank or whatever. But by the time they found her, at this point now, she kind of came to her senses and was like flagging them down and yelling and calling for help. And so she got rescued on the 9th. And so what we have is, after she got, kind of healed up to health and everything, we have her story, which honestly has been kind of broken. And then there's some weird reports for here. So I'm going to kind of jump ahead again, in that there was one news report that came out from this years later. There are her statements, but there's also a report that Korovina's daughter got paid a large sum of money to never talk about this again. So there's some very weird things on how this was handled on the backside of this. So just keep that in mind as I get into the story. Now we're going to go back to the story of what happened. So on August 4th, she did say that, all the rest of the group was dead. On August 4th, they camped out on a very barren section of hill, which is very curious. It's windy, it's raining. You have this kind of remnants of a typhoon or whatever overhead. There was a tree line and forest only about 1 kilometer down the hill from where they were at. And there was actually a emergency rescue station about a 30-minute walk up the hill from where they camped, which would have had a roof and firewood and the ability to get heat and shelter. They camped out in a very open area. A couple of theories for this. One, they said it was kind of her technique in training them to put them kind of in adverse circumstances to see how they would handle it. So that's one theory. Another theory was that Korovina was possibly concerned that she was going to miss the meeting point with her daughter, and that hiking down into the forest or up to the station would have caused too many delays. And so she wanted to stay at the original camping spot to be able to keep the schedule. Who knows? We don't know at this point. What we do know is, up to this point, they were in good spirits. They were eating well. Nothing adverse was going on, despite the bad weather, despite the heavy rain, the cold temperatures. They camp in this open area. Then the report is around 4 a.m., they started having problems with the wind taking out some of the guide ropes to the tents. They fix that, but by 6 a.m., some of the poles get pulled over. Basically, the tents come down, and now they're out in the open and getting soaking wet up on this hill. They also, at some point here, it's really unclear. Again, some of these things, I'm going to try, just so you guys know, and if you research this, you'll see there's a lot of reports and accounts of this that kind of contradict each other. So instead of giving you a bunch of contradictory stuff, I'm just going to kind of keep some of this high level to hopefully keep it from being confusing. But if it does get confusing, let me know in the chat. At some point, it actually changes over to snow. So we're talking, it's pretty, even though it usually doesn't get below 50 this time of year, we're talking near freezing and also heavy downpour. So they are completely wet. Their sleeping bags are wet. They are soaking wet. They decide in the morning to get up and just get ready. So they have a meal, a hot meal. Hi, Ruth. Thanks for joining us. And they begin to hike down kind of towards the forest. In the very beginning, when they're starting to talk about this, Alexander, who was the 23-year-old, claimed to be or by accounts was the strongest, most fit of them all, was complaining that he wasn't feeling well. They start walking. They don't even get like a kilometer, and he starts falling down. Falls down repeatedly. At one point, Korovina sits down with him to kind of take care of him, kind of nurse him, and tells the others to keep going. There's an account after this that they don't get very far, and she calls them to come back. Not sure at what time this is seen, but there are claims that at this point they saw him frothing from the mouth and bleeding out of his ears. But also by the time they came back up, they said his eyes were very, very huge, and basically Korovina told them that he was dead. She then told them to kind of go back down towards the forest. So Valentina, who was the 17-year-old one that was also very fit, grabs Victoria, who was the girl that Korovina didn't want to go along, her hand to take her down to the forest. And Victoria bites her hand and pulls and runs away. Dennis, the one who took the place of somebody that left out, runs and hides behind a bunch of rocks and goes into his sleeping bag. She looks back now, and at this point, Tatiana, who is the secretary, falls down onto her knees, starts crawling towards a rock, and starts repeatedly bashing her head into the rock. And just bashes her head, bashes her head, bashes her head, bashes her head, bashes her head until she goes limp. Valentina now turns and sees that both Timur and Victoria fall to the ground, and they're acting like they can't breathe, and they're starting to tear off their clothes and clutching at their throat. All the meanwhile, they are foaming at the mouth, and some reports of bleeding out the ears, some reports of bleeding out the eyes. Kind of mixed claims here, but it seems like Dennis at this point kind of snaps Valentina. I'm picturing from the account that Valentina is just watching this all like in shock. Dennis runs and like hits her and says, "We got to go." And they start running towards the forest. She gets ahead, looks back to see where he's at, and sees that he drops to the ground now, holding his throat, tearing at things and foaming at the mouth and bleeding out the eyes and ears. At this point, she runs into the woods, hops into her sleeping bag, puts a tent over her, and sleeps for. So this is actually the morning of August 5th now. Sleeps for that night. As odd as that sounds. Wakes up, realizes that she doesn't have enough equipment to survive. She has to go back up to where they're at. So she goes back up. She says, now this is what gets interesting, because again, some of this gets conflicting. So, take some of this for what it is, that when she gets back up there was basically two groups. They were all dead, but there was Alexander with Korovina next to him. And then farther down the hill where the other ones were starting to go down towards the tree line was the other four. And they were all dead, or at least she was saying they were not moving. They had clothes removed. Which I'll get to that in a bit. So she gets more supplies out of Korovina's pack and sets off into the woods. And so she's walking. Eventually she finds power lines. And so she starts following the power lines and finds a village. And so she gets to the village thinking she might be saved. Turns out that this is an abandoned village. So she's in this village and nobody's there. So she keeps moving on. And let's see here. So we are, they move on and she finds the river and starts going down the river. And she said at this point that she was kind of reserved, that she knew she was just going to die. She didn't have a lot of energy, didn't have a lot of stuff, supplies or anything left. And that is when the kayakers from the Ukraine saw her. So they pick her up and, she comes back, and then these are all these tests. Now, give me a second here as I'm just trying to scan all my notes to see if I missed anything important before we go to the next spot. So again, bleeding from the ears, foaming from the mouth, clutching, acting like they can't breathe, ripping off clothes. I'm going to get into all these different theories as to what possibly happened, but I will say that there is almost well, I don't know Mary too, if she just went to sleep or if she just ran and hid and just kind of buried herself over everything. Maybe she was waiting to die, but this plays into some of the theories too. But I will say every theory out there, and there are 4 that I'll kind of highlight near the end, that I think are better than others. No, the group leader didn't survive. The one that survived is the 17-year-old that they said he was very mentally and physically strong. So again, just to recap, the ones that died were, I'll pull it back up here. It'll let me do it. So he is the person that initially collapsed. This is the group leader that then went to aid him. She climbed over and started smashing her head on the rock. She bit her hand. This is the survivor here. These 2 collapsed. He's the one that kind of kicked her and said, let's get running, and ran. And then he collapsed and didn't make it all the way back. So anyway, so that's a quick recap. So I'll get into some of these theories, but I'll say that, that there's 4 that I think make the most sense. But there's a lot of different theories out here, and almost everything has a flaw kind of in the logic, or a piece of it that doesn't make sense. So first of all, they finally go to do the rescue. Another weird thing, the rescue party, this fuels some speculation as to what could have been going on here. The rescue party does not go out to recover the bodies until a month later. Now, one explanation is that things were it's even though this is a kind of common touristy area, it's still Siberia, and this was after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So there was one quote I saw from someone that actually lived in Russia saying, Moscow had its own trouble keeping everything together this far out. Logistics would be very difficult. So they didn't think it was very surprising, but still a lot of people call out how weird it was that it was 4 months to go back out there. Leads some speculation. Could this have been some kind of weapon or nerve gas, which is one of the theories I'll get into, that they had to wait for it to dissipate before they could go out there. It is known in this part of the world, they did lots of tests. There's probably a lot of tests that we don't even know about. There is this might be a story somewhere later about anthrax. Actually, I believe Yeltsin was actually like the mayor of this town where this happened. But there was a plant that produced anthrax, and somebody removed the filters. And so there was one evening where this plant just shot anthrax spores out the exhaust into the whole entire town and killed a whole bunch of people. So there's definitely, some odd things. This was a country and government at the time that was not particularly kind of viewed people as expendable in resources. So, there's a chance that there could have been something going on there. I don't think it would have been a deliberate weapon attack, but they could have been wrong place, wrong time. The biggest thing that doesn't fit here is this is a touristy area. Why would they choose that? Siberia is so huge. There's certainly more remote places they could do these kind of things. So it doesn't add up really that they would do a test in that spot. But another thing could be disposal. Was something disposed in a bad area and they ended up, happening upon it. That feeds into one of the theories I'll get to later. And then also during this time of, a lot of people lost jobs when the Soviet Union collapsed, and there was a huge black market for things. They feel a lot of stuff went to Iran after the Soviet Union fell. So who's to say there wasn't some kind of black market movement of, nerve gas or something, and, wrong place, wrong time. They stumbled upon the wrong folks and something like this happened. There's also a theory that Valentina was a spy and either, was collecting information from, something that might be near there and killed the other ones, or so that's a theory out there. The official explanation after they collected the bodies was that they all died of hypothermia except for Korovina, who died of a heart attack. Now, who was paid the silence money? Korovina's daughter, the one that, interestingly enough, never met up with her mom's group, kept going, and then took a flight all the way back to Kazakhstan and found out after she was back home that her mom was dead. So Actually, Mary, you're hitting some of these. I'm going to try to hit. There's a lot of theories. I'm going to try to hit them all, and then kind of do a more deep dive on the ones that I found the most intriguing. As I said, there's 4 that I think are the most intriguing. So the official explanation was hypothermia. Yes, it was summer. Yes, it usually doesn't get below 50 degrees, but there were reports that it actually snowed there. The weather reports weren't really good back then. Again, this is, pre-internet. I think even some of the satellite technology wasn't nearly as good as it is now. It's funny because, for those of us that were already, grown at this point, to think about that as, being old times is kind of weird, but it was. If they spent, 24, 48 hours in downpours, soaking wet, high winds, if this was the remnants of a hurricane or typhoon that came through the area. So they're very, very wet. It's very, very windy. They chose to camp in that open area where the wind tore down the tent. So, they're in the pouring rain out there soaking wet. It's not unreasonable that they could get hypothermia, even though it's not, usually the conditions you would think of. I'll also say, too, these aren't heights where altitude sickness would be a normal thing. There's even some examples in some of the research I did of regular family resorts here, like in Utah, that are at this elevation or even higher, where people go and, do things without. So these aren't altitudes where people have typically have trouble, where altitude sickness would be an issue. And particularly these were people, this wasn't like the first time any of these folks hiked. These were all, even though they're young, they were all experienced hikers in this area, or for this type of terrain, I should say. This was their first time in this area. So anyway, the official explanation was that, the bodies were found. It was interesting that there's claims that the bodies were found in a different place than where she described. Now, granted, memory and all the trauma, who's to say that what she said, couldn't have been changed, but they claim that it was more in 3 pairs. So they were all paired up, and they were higher up the mountain than where she was describing. So again, who knows? I'll also add, there is a weird report around that time of a quote unquote sticky fog that was in this region that was reported by other people. Now, if that fog was part of the weapon, then you would think these other people would have died as well. But it's just there was this weird report of this really weird, dense, sticky fog during this storm as well. Again, just interesting. I'm just adding things out here. What doesn't fit on the hypothermia piece is hypothermia. You don't froth from the mouth and bleed from the ears. And also there was this manic activity. Now, ripping off the clothes there's this part of, and this happened in part of the explanation with that Dyatlov Pass, of where your body actually almost reverses. And even though you're freezing, you actually feel like you're burning up. So like the cold sensation turns to heat. And so people will start taking off their clothes. So that would be consistent. But the foaming and the bleeding from the ears doesn't fit, as well as this manic behavior doesn't fit hypothermia. You think, people freezing to death, they tend to get more lethargic, more slowed down. If you hear the accounts of, what happened to people like on Everest and stuff, eventually people just kind of sit down and then they don't move. Almost like what Korovina did. They said that she sat down to help him and never got back up again. And there were no real report. There's kind of mixed reports as to whether she had the blood coming out, and again, even the autopsy thinks that she had a heart attack. So it seems like maybe what happened to Korovina was different. There's even some reports, but it all gets mixed, that when, and I forget, I'm getting the names mixed up now, but Val, the one that survived, when she hiked back up the next morning, that Korovina was actually still alive and gave her some instructions on what to do to survive. So again, there's some mixed reports. It gets kind of foggy here, but this kind of manic, running around. They said they were running all over the place, and one's biting her hand, and one's bashing her head on a rock, and this kind of manic, crazy behavior is not consistent with hypothermia. Another weird scenario, and I'm just going to tick off a whole bunch of weird ones here. The area is volcanic. There are reports of, and lots of earthquakes in this area. There's reports of gases venting. So one theory is some kind of toxic gas vented from the ground just right around this time. And poisoned them all. Again, not sure. I need to do a little more research. I'm not really. Some of these other things I'll talk about can explain that. These symptoms. I'm not aware of any of the real common poison gases, and I'm certainly not an expert, but I am a chemist and was always kind of interested in toxicology stuff. So I have kind of a interest in these things. I'm not aware of anything off the top of my head that would like naturally occur in volcanic vents that would create those specific kind of symptoms. Interesting, Steph, as asking about wildlife. I did see some reports of weird behavior from wildlife, including deer not acting afraid of humans and bear like throwing themselves onto train tracks, which sounds really weird. I don't know how much to base that on. Again, it was only one report that I was looking at, but it is kind of an odd thing. And since you asked, yeah, it could be interesting. Well, antidote. So you guys are, it's interesting. You guys are all mentally going down some of the paths we're going to go on this. They also think, part of this was just a series of bad decisions driven by Korovina's desire to meet her daughter. And so she didn't deviate and make choices that would have kept them drier and safer in order to meet this timeline. And then it ended up compounding on them. Obviously, weapons tests. There's a bunch of different stories on this. Could it have been a sound weapon? Could it have been a radioactive weapon? Could it have been a chemical weapon? Was there some kind of weapons test that they happened to inadvertently go on, or was actually tested on them? If you, particularly if you go the spy route, that the one survivor was actually a spy, and that would explain her survival. It could also explain the inconsistent stories, because again, kind of the more foggy you would make this, the harder it would be to piece things together. So that's certainly one of the. It's not one of my four, but that would be another explanation, that she's actually a spy, and the rest of this is all kind of just made up to cover the truth. Another weird one is this infrasound, whether that's a weapon or there are other weird reports of this area of people feeling very paranoid, very sad, very upset. So there's some claims, I don't think they've been scientifically verified or anything, but there's some claims that there's kind of a weird resonance in these mountains. And with the wind coming through and the storm coming through, could that have set up this kind of vibration where they say, I believe it is 7 hertz. You can't hear it, but that's basically a frequency that a lot of our organs function on. So it can resonate and affect the organs. And so one theory is that this is what was going on, and this is what would have caused the mental problems as well as the bleeding, as it would have caused organs to rupture and things along those lines, as well as the weird behavior. So that is one of the theories out there, that it was this kind of infrasound resonance that was doing that to them. The last one, and this is going to feed into some of the theories, so this is kind of interesting, is there is a plant that grows on that mountain called goldenroot. I haven't researched this, but I guess you can get this in stores. You can get it. It is this miracle drug. Russians have done research on this, saying that it can, regular ingestion of this goldenroot can actually help your body adapt to adverse circumstances and can adapt and, recover from things very quickly. It also, interesting stuff you say about microwaves. You think about some of these experiments, then you hear about like Havana syndrome and some of these people that are getting attacked with this, like these sound weapons. That does make it very interesting, because this has been a very early test for that. But anyway, this goldenroot also has the active ingredient that is in Viagra. So there is a black market for goldenroot. Goldenroot grows very slowly. It takes like 12 years to grow. That will become important later, because when you grow that slowly, you can't really get eaten down to down to your core. So plants like this have defense mechanisms. I'll get to that. But anyway, Korovina had a sack full of goldenroot. Now, there are legends that if you take more than you need, the mountain spirits will curse you. So there is also this thing that the mountain spirits cursed the group, and that is why they died. There's also another explanation that can kind of tie those two together that I will get to. But first, I'll look to see if there's any questions before I'll get to the 4 that I saw. Steph, I did see the reference to Skin. I have to go back and I am not as familiar with the Skinwalker Ranch, or at least not familiar with stories that overlap with this. So now you have me intrigued. Yeah, this is interesting. So a lot of you guys are on a lot of the similar. We're on kind of the similar paths here. So yeah, so we will get into some of these theories. So I guess first theory number one, and then I'll take whatever questions come in as we go. First theory number one, and I'm going to add this. I'm going to say there's 5, is that, yes, there's some rumors of espionage. Let's say that the survivor was the spy and that these other 6 were executed at some point, possibly poisoned. And then the rest of this is all made up. And even her stories is what happened to them, all made up as a giant cover. Whether she was a spy, whatever side she was spying on in this, it's just an interesting story. Well, Dolly, they were a hiking club from the school that she was at, and she did what? This wasn't her first. She was like nationally known, kind of famous as a survivalist and naturalist, and did hikes in lots of different mountains. They did the Ural Mountains above the Arctic Circle, the Tian Shan Mountains, the Altai Mountains. There's a whole bunch that she has listed to her credit. And so this was a group, and these were all, none of these, I believe none of them, this would have been their first expedition with her. They all had gone on other hikes with her. So she ran kind of this club and group. And so even though they were young, it's not like this was like a high school field trip or something. These were all experienced at doing this. Sorry, just getting kind of caught in this. So anyway, back to this. The other one that is maybe a simple explanation is that it truly was hypothermia, and that they froze to death. And for a variety of reasons, either just the trauma or just, foggy memory back or whatever, or even guilt about her, running into the forest and leaving them behind. It played back in her head that, they were foaming out of the mouth and dropping as poison. And so maybe that just her memory or recollection isn't very good, and that they truly just froze to death. That is certainly an explanation. And that would, it's the most boring, because then there's no cover up. Doesn't explain the hush money. That's the weird thing about the daughter getting paid money to not talk about it. But again, that's a possibility. Now, 3 that I found intriguing from other people as I did this, and so I wanted to give credit. I found 2 very interesting ones from Natasha Mullins, who wrote a article on this on medium.com. The first one has to do with nerve gas, and this makes sense, at least according to the account from the survivor. So nerve gas is very water soluble. Nerve gas is very dense and can stay low to the ground. So her theory was that this wasn't actually near a nerve gas attack, but with all the rain and the fact that they could be disposing of things, Lake Baikal has a bunch of stuff disposed in it, that they could have somebody somewhere could have disposed of these chemical agents somewhere near that mountain. The rain, the heavy rains, it's water soluble, so it rained down the hill. And then as temperatures warm, because this was early in the morning, then sun comes up, as you know, you start seeing like that fog and stuff coming up. The water could actually act as like a carrier for the nerve gas going up off the ground. Alexander falls because he already had the hypothermia. He wasn't feeling good. So he legitimately falls, but now he happens to have the bad fortune of falling into a spot where this was coming up. So he gets it. He starts foaming. He starts getting sick. Korovina goes down to help him. She's down there. She gets it. The one story was the one boy went and hid behind rocks, so he got down to the ground. The other girl, Tatiana, goes to help her, comes down, leans over. She's low. Still doesn't explain why she was hitting her head on the rocks, but what if it was a convulsion? And so it just looked like she was hitting her head on the rocks when she was really convulsing. Who knows? The only one that is, at least from the account, never got close to the ground was the one who survived. So was this merely that they were in a spot where they had this runoff of the nerve agent starting to evaporate off the ground, and just the ones that got close got exposed and perished. And she ran far enough away. By the time she woke up the next morning to go back up the hill to them, that evaporated off, and she got her equipment and ended up not getting exposed. That is one theory. Certainly makes sense. Another theory, which I've seen some folks posted on here, was that there's no account. One thing I'll qualify here is there's no accounts of them foraging. They brought their food. They were cooking food. That doesn't mean they didn't, though. So there is a theory that they ate bad mushrooms, either poison mushrooms or the poison mushroom effect isn't consistent because medically, usually everybody's metabolism is a little different. Their the way they would go through the food and everything's a little different. So that eating something that would supposedly make everybody drop dead that quickly is a little inconsistent. Not saying it couldn't happen, but that's a little inconsistent. But one thing that could happen is, and I forget exactly how you pronounce it, cyclobin or whatever, one of the psychoactive things in mushrooms. I've read this. I don't know this. But a common, excuse my dog's going nuts in the background. I always love when this happens. One of the common hallucinations, supposedly, on hallucinogenic mushrooms is bleeding out of the eyes and ears, seeing people like bleeding out of their eyes and ears. So is there the chance that they were actually freezing to death? She was actually kind of tripping on these mushrooms, saw these people bleeding when they really weren't bleeding at all, had these hallucinations, was kind of paranoid and everything, ran, hid in the woods, and then kind of woke up and was back to her senses and hiked back up there and saw that everybody was dead, when indeed they just basically froze to death, or possibly were also hallucinating, and that would explain all the weird things. But if you got a bunch of people just hallucinating, then who knows what's real and what's not. So that is another theory on this one. Armored Skeptic had a very interesting theory as well, and that is around the golden root. And there's really two different ways you could look at this. One is there was claims that they were likely all chewing on golden root throughout this trek, and particularly if they were in this adverse conditions where they were getting very wet. They were found to be, even though they claimed they were eating all the time, they were found to be malnourished when they did the autopsy. One of the things that golden root does do is it inhibits appetite. So there's a chance that they were not eating as much as they should because they felt much better. Again, excuse me, they are going absolutely nuts behind me. So that's a chance. But there's also a chance that the one survivor ate more either on the trip or just in general, that she had greater resilience to whatever took out the rest of them. So that's the side theory. The main theory is that, as I mentioned earlier, this is a slow-growing plant, so it needs a defense mechanism. So if it's not prepared the right way, or I guess under stress, I don't know the full conditions on this, but there are conditions where golden root can produce cyanide. Cyanide and cyanide poisoning, not so much the bleeding, but cyanide poisoning could be very consistent with the other things that were being shown there. The foaming at the mouth, cyanide kills you very, very quickly. It binds to your blood, so you can't breathe. So people that are, even though you can breathe, the oxygen is not getting to your blood. So people will act like they're choking. There's reports of people that, when they're poisoned by cyanide, they'll grab their throat and fall over. So there's a chance that they all, they're soaking wet. They're going to go on this long hike. Let's all go have some golden root. And they all end up having, sharing a piece of golden root that was either not prepared right or under enough stress that it had a level of cyanide in it that, and honestly, almost any level of cyanide is toxic, but had a toxic level in there, and they all died of cyanide poisoning. Exception being maybe the survivor didn't have any, or had less. So that is another theory. So out of those, those last 5, the spy, that it really was hypothermia and that she just has her memory of it kind of messed up and more colored, residual nerve gas, hallucinating from mushrooms, or the cyanide and the golden root. Those to me sound more interesting and possibly more plausible than some of the other things that were out there. Not that those other things couldn't happen, but again, if it was a weapons attack, it's a weird place to choose to do a weapons attack. Because again, this is not a, I'm trying to think of like a good, maybe like Zion National Park or something. It's not like the Grand Canyon, but it's a spot that, there's a lot of tourists in the summer. So you wouldn't think that, like our government, if it was going to do something, probably wouldn't do any kind of weird test in the middle of a national park. They would probably do it out in the middle of nowhere, like out in the middle of Nevada or something. So also Mary said about sarin, the Russians have, and they've actually used it as an assassination tool not that long ago. They have a class of nerve gases, Novichok, that are, I think it's like 10 times worse than VX, and VX is like 10 times worse than sarin. So it's like highly, highly, highly toxic. So yeah, there's a chance that there was some of that residual runoff somewhere. So, I think all 5 of these have their merits. But it was very interesting. I had not heard of this story before until last week, and I found it very, very interesting. So I'm curious your thoughts, and that is the story. But as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to kind of just let this roll into the after show and have it kind of an open-ended chat here. And then depending on when, after we answer kind of the main questions,